Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen. I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York in Bayside, Queens. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate people about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Today's talk is entitled Curation is Care and features Dare Turner, Curator of Indigenous Art at the Brooklyn Museum, who will discuss the practice of community representation, engagement, and dialogue through the curation of historical and contemporary Native art in encyclopedic museums. The Kupferberg Holocaust Center in Bayside, New York, is situated on the traditional land of the Mantinecock people who continue to live here today. We offer gratitude and respect to all of the Indigenous people of Turtle Island, past, present, and future, including the Lenape and Shinnecock peoples. Our event today is a collaboration between the Kupferberg Holocaust Center and the Gallery and Museum Studies program in the Art and Design Department here at Queensborough. And it builds upon the KHC's longstanding tradition of connecting core themes within Holocaust and human rights education with how they are expressed and taught within and at museums and education centers. Our program today is co-sponsored by 7 organizations around the U.S., and they include the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University, the Reef Center for Human Rights and Conflict Resolution at Christopher Newport University, the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center in White Plains, the Ray Walpaugh Institute for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at Western Washington University, the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan University, the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention at Binghamton University, and the Human Rights Institute at Kean University. After our presentation, we'll host a brief Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And now to kick things off, please join me in welcoming today's moderator and my dear colleague, Kat Griffin, who's program coordinator and faculty member at the Gallery and Museum Studies program at Queensborough, and is also a faculty member within the CUNY School of Professional Studies. Kat, the floor is yours.
Laura, thank you so much for your very warm welcome. And thank you as well to the Kupferberg Holocaust Center and to the Art and Design Department, especially the chair, Kathleen Wentrek, for her support and the department's support of the program. As Laura mentioned, I am faculty member and program coordinator for the Gallery Museum Studies program at Queensborough Community College. Our program is the only associate's degree in the CUNY system, making it a uniquely affordable entry point into the museum field in our region. So welcome to all the students who are present today and also all of the community members as well. This program is part of our ongoing Human Rights and the Museum series, which in part comes out of a living land acknowledgement resulting from the Native American Survivance Project at the Kupferberg Holocaust Center, which took the form of a colloquium, exhibition, and publication starting in 2018, co-led by myself and Danielle Means. For this reason, Indigenous voices and viewpoints are centered in many of the series Human Rights Museum series events, including today's program. Many past events from the series are available to view via the KHC's website and YouTube, including an earlier program with our speaker today, Dare Turner, on the topic Decolonizing Design and Cultural Symbols. Now, for today's event, Curation as Care, even those in attendance, I think, with less experience with the museum field than some students, are probably somewhat aware of the work of curators like Dare Turner, who craft the exhibitions we experience and help us understand objects in museum collections and the stories of their makers and practitioners. But the work of a curator is far more than that. I start each curatorial class I teach in the spring semester by speaking with my students about how the word curate originates from the Latin word cura, meaning care. Certainly, the root of the word connects the work to the care for museum collections, but in the present day, this also pertains to the care a curator puts into collaborating with communities and colleagues and engaging diverse audiences and stories. To that end, Dare Turner will address the concept of curation as care, also the title of one of her catalog essays, as it relates to her own curatorial work and her role stewarding the Brooklyn Museum's Indigenous Art collection. To introduce her briefly, Turner is an enrolled member of the Yurok Tribe of California. She served on the faculty of Maryland Institute College of Art. She studied at Stanford University and Bard Graduate Center. She is currently the curator of Indigenous Art at the Brooklyn Museum and was previously the assistant curator of Indigenous Arts of the Americas at the Baltimore Art Museum, where she curated exhibitions including Arctic Artistry, Stripes and Stars, Reclaiming Lakota Independence, this exhibition, which she spoke about in that prior program. And maybe most relevant to today's discussion, she'll be speaking about Preoccupied, Indigenizing the Museum. More than an exhibition, actually more than 9 exhibitions. This was a major 2004-2005 initiative featuring those exhibitions, interpretive interventions, and other activities, audio guides, and materials throughout the Baltimore Art Museum's collections. Dare has also contributed to exhibitions at other institutions, including Bard Graduate Center, Walter Arts Museum, Utah Museum of Fine Art, and Yellowstone National Park. We are very pleased and appreciative of Dare as our speaker for the second time in this series. Thank you for being with us. I will hand over the Zoom to you.
Super. Thanks so much for this kind invitation. I'm going to start my screen share now. So I'm really excited to share some of my curatorial practice today with this group. As mentioned before, my name is Dare Turner, and I'm the Curator of Indigenous Art at the Brooklyn Museum. And I often reflect on what my role is as a curator. Why should I curate things in the first place? And that really boils down to a few core answers for me. First, I think a curator's superpower is that we help foster empathy in the viewers that are coming into the museum. We also express gratitude both to the artists that made the works and the works themselves and the visitors. And we embody care with everything we do. That's a mandatory element of curatorial work in my mind, is caring for all of the relatives that come into contact with Native art. So we're going to dive in and talk about a few different projects. I'm going to spend a lot of my time discussing Preoccupied Indigenizing the Museum, which was a major initiative back in 2024 and 2025 that I co-organized with my co-curator, the wonderful Leila Grothe, with the assistance of a curatorial fellow, Elise Boulanger. And this initiative encompassed 9 exhibitions, which we can take a look at, but we started with some really basic questions in thinking through why do we present Native art within this context, and how do we want to frame it? We went into the project, Leila and I, with this idea that decolonizing is an interesting idea, but it's not exactly what we want to do. And we weren't sure why that was. So we decided to invite all of the different people that touched the project, all of the artists whose work were featured in group shows or solo exhibitions, the designer that put together the catalog, the different community members who lent their voice to shape the trajectory of the project. We invited them to gather at the very beginning of the endeavor at a purpose-built artist retreat space in Baltimore called The Last Resort, that's run by Derek Adams. And this was a really welcoming home setup. We invited everybody to come together and cook together and to share, concerns about the field. Maybe they wanted to bring books that they had worked on, or, show slide decks of curatorial projects they've worked on in the past, share writings if they were going to be featured in the catalog. We all wanted to come together in a really friendly space where we could come forward as individuals rather than as roles. I wasn't there as the curator, the organizer of this show. I was there as Dare, a Baltimorean who has a family, who loves to cook, who really cares about Native art and wants to show it in a new way within the field. I think Baltimore is an interesting venue to have a major Native art exhibition or a Native takeover of the museum. It's an interesting site for that because a lot of Baltimoreans don't realize that there are many Native people who live in the community. So we all wanted to gather together and confront these issues head on and think through what are the questions that are bringing us all together, and why should our show focus on questions of indigenizing instead of decolonizing. as we gathered in those spaces and talked through the issues at hand, we landed on a reason why decolonize felt like it was the wrong framework. It's centering, literally centering the wrong audience, the colonizers. So instead, we want to center the Indigenous folks who are lending their artistic brilliance to these museum spaces. So with that pivot, just with that single word, we were able to reframe the way that we executed care around this project and upheld all of the different artists' priorities and narratives. So in thinking about fostering empathy across the museum and within the galleries, we did a lot of community engagement, both within the museum and without. So within the museum, we did wonderful decolonization 101 trainings with Live Oak Consulting. And that was a really helpful framework to get our head around who needs to do the work of the decolonize, who needs to decolonize? Is it artists or is it the institutions? And we landed on that being a kind of interinstitutional initiative. What does it mean to grapple with the colonial roots of the establishment of a major encyclopedic museum? That is something for museum curators and internal staff to confront on our own and not put it in front of artists as something that it was their job to deal with. We wanted to be able to confront those issues on our own. And then we were thinking about community engagement. We wanted to work across the museum and pop the curatorial bubble. I think it felt equally important that folks that work in the finance department attend this training and see how the roots of colonization uphold encyclopedic museums' approaches to date, and what are the ways that we can really pressure that. We also thought about community engagement beyond the boards, the boundaries of the museum walls. So it was very important for us to partner with local Native community members. At times, those were working with wonderful powwow leaders like the ones we see here, but it was also working with healthcare providers. One of the largest Native organizations in Baltimore, Native American Lifelines, is focused specifically on health. And while at first glance, the connection between health and art might not make sense, the more we talked to these folks, the better we understood how relevant the museum is for to support Native communities' health. These folks kept telling us over and over again, we feel invisibilized in the city. We don't feel like people understand our culture or know that we exist. And by hearing that, we can better understand how to present Native stories within this space. We can make sure that we hold space for both difficult narratives, but also celebratory ones where people can see their own communities on their own terms. We wanted to make space for all of those different ambitions as an arm of care, linking all the different elements of the project. So all of the collaborative efforts culminated in 9 exhibitions, which you see here. I opened 11 exhibitions in 2024, which was probably 10 too many. So if you end up being a curator, learn a lesson from me and bear that in mind. But this was a really unprecedented opportunity to center Native voices at the Baltimore Museum of Art. Prior to my appointment as the assistant curator of Native art or Indigenous art of the Americas there, the last time the museum had done a Native art exhibition was 1992. So there was decades of correction that had to take place, and we were glad that we could do one full force project to kind of equal the playing field a bit. So we had 3 different thematic exhibitions that drew together historical belongings with contemporary art, seen on that top row. Enduring Buffalo looked at the ways in which the near total systematic eradication of the buffalo and the ways in which colonizers utilized that extermination to force Native folks onto reservations and to strip them of their lifeways, and what were the ways in which we see that in the art. That was the topic of that exhibition. Then Finding Home thought considered all the different ways in which Native community members maintain a sense of home despite different pressures, be them seasonal migration or the forced abduction of children who were sent to boarding school. So what does home look like amidst all of those different pressures? And Illustrating Agency looked at the ways in which Native artists from the 20th century to today have asserted agency in representations of their communities and of their livelihoods. Then we also had one show that was guest curated by Sky Hopinka, Don't Wait for Me, Just Tell Me Where You're Going, which was focused on time-based media works. He runs a collective called Cousin. So there were many emerging wonderful time-based media artists' work highlighted in that presentation. And then we also had solo presentations of work by Deani Whitehawk, Caroline Monet, Nicholas Galanin, Laura Ortman, and Dana Claxton. And we'll take a look at the latter two in a minute. But to give you a sense of the breadth of the project, I also want to mention a few other things we did. So we wanted this project to touch all areas of the museum. We were in nearly every programmable space, but there's some galleries like the American Wing where we wanted to have interventions that could outlive the run of this particular project. So one such intervention was an audio tour where we invited local Native community members to speak about any work they wanted in the museum. We said, it doesn't need to be in any particular location. It doesn't need to be a Native artwork. It just needs to be something that speaks to you and sparks, maybe gratitude or empathy or care or interest. And it was really interesting to see the array of the sorts of works that people spoke about. One of my favorites that you don't see here is one of the scholars we worked with, who was a part of our community advisory panel, Ashley Minner, spoke about a vacuum cleaner that was in the Decorative Arts Gallery because her grandma had that vacuum cleaner, and that was such a status symbol and such a major signal that she had arrived in Baltimore. So it was wonderful to hear the different narratives that emerged and to see the opportunities for those to outlive the months, almost year-long run of the shows. And then another major arm of the project was the publication. So we wanted this to be an experimental book that did something new and did that both through a design methodology as well as this scholarly methodology. So we were incredibly privileged to work with Sebastian Alban of Atomi Studios up in Montreal, who designed the Book of My Dreams. You see that beautiful die-cut cover here. And then we had featured more scholarly essays from Heather Autone, John Lukovic, Paul Chott Smith, as well as a newly commissioned poem by Hyde Erdrich, a new comic that we commissioned that featured Pueblo Jones, a reimagined Indigenous figure representing Indiana Jones. And all of this was knit together with more diaristic essays that Leila and I wrote. We wanted to speak as people rather than, just disembodied scholars in the field. It felt important that people understand our perspectives, why we're doing this project in particular, what I thought about when I watched Indiana Jones as I was preparing for this project and realized, wow, as an audience member, I'm being invited to root for the good guy looter instead of the bad guy looter, but there's no avenue for me to question as a viewer of this movie, why are we rooting for looters in the first place? So this was a good opportunity to generate new dialogues with artists. We had a lot of artist interview snippets in this, and to get a sense of all of the care that each of these contributors brought to this project. And I mentioned I wanted to look at a couple of these more closely, a couple of the shows. So Dana Claxton's Spark was the first show I wanted to mention. So Dana Claxton presents these wonderful pieces that she refers to as fireboxes, we may know as light boxes, that present Indigenous sitters that are adorned with regalia from their community. And they're really though one might view this as a way that their identity is hidden, it's actually a way in which their identity is celebrated and displayed. While we're not seeing the individual's face, we do get to see all of the culture she carries and that shapes her. So this was a really beautiful suite of works that we wanted to focus on with this presentation. And you get to see here our newly commissioned work on the right, Hedra, Sade, and her girls, in which we see Sade, who's in the center of the image on the left of the 5 fireboxes. We see her in her younger years, and now on the right, we see her with her 2 older daughters and her youngest infant who's swaddled in this cradle, in a cradle board. And we see these women shrouded in love and care as they have received regalia over the years from their families, or they borrowed regalia from their friends for this presentation. And here we get to see that intergenerational love and support of the girls as they're growing into women. So care felt very much at the core of what Dana put together for this show. And then another element of care that featured majorly in this show was we actually brought works from the fireboxes themselves, as well as works from the historic collection at the Baltimore Museum of Art. We brought those into the gallery, so we have a dialogue between the fireboxes and cultural belongings. And Dana actually lent her voice to some of these labels. And in the case of the dress we see in the case on the right there, she wrote a label that imagined what it would have been to wear this dress as she's walking through the grass and hearing the jingles, the tin cones, making noise as she moves wearing the dress. And I think that this inspires a greater sense of empathy when we can imagine, or when an artist can imagine the life and bringing life into the historical record. So what is it to activate these historical belongings? What is it to wear this dress? How does that foster empathy when we read those labels? Do we experience something different through that imaginative activity? So Dana was a wonderful illustration of how we can embody empathy in the didactics and the labels. She brings enormous care and gratitude to the sitters that participate with her and frame their works. And then Laura Ortman brought a different sort of care to her project. So Laura Ortman, Wood That Sings, presented Laura's work, My Soul Remainer, a time-based media presentation. It was displayed in our black box, along with a historic Apache violin by Amos Gustana. And Laura is an incredibly accomplished violinist who also plays both Western and Apache violins. And we thought it would be such a wonderful opportunity for her to actually work on a collection object in this case. So I hope I've So here we see Laura actually working with our conservation department to restring this violin. So this was something, doing this kind of collaborative care of the object itself was something very new to the museum. And this can serve as a model for the field. So the Baltimore Museum of Art had never done anything like this, where we've invited an artist to restore something from the historical collection, but none of us on staff were played Apache violins. I don't believe any of us were musicians. And there were just sensitivities to questions of like, what materials should be used to restring this bow, or to restring the violin and its bow? How do those materials need to be treated? What care needs to be brought to that process that Laura already knew? She already had this very sophisticated sense of what this violin needed physically and like emotionally and spiritually. So she was able to do a much better job than anybody else. She was the perfect person for this job because she brought such great care to her work. So it was a very moving experience supporting the conservation in this way. We got to see Laura play a song for the violin when she had restrung it on her own violin. And just to see that the way that she cared for this historical violin also cared for us as staff, also cared for viewers as people who visited the show, because they could actually see how this violin wanted to be. They got to actually see it come full circle because it had been broken previous to her repairing it. So that was a very moving moment. And amidst all of these projects at Baltimore, I also curated the Brooklyn Museum's outdoor stoop in June of 2024. I invited Nico Williams, who is an Anishinaabe beadworker, to show his work on our plaza. I'm sure many of you have driven by the museum, so maybe you even drove by this presentation back when it was up. But Nico Williams, I See Your Light, drew together beadwork from his own practice that was inspired by historical belongings from the Brooklyn Museum's collection, with jingles that are seen on regalia that Anishinaabe people wear today in powwows, for instance, and that have these particular ones have imagery that's also drawn from the collection. So let's take a closer look at that. Nico is a very accomplished beadworker who often creates beaded items that reflect the detritus of life. So it could be a IKEA shopping bag that's entirely made out of beads, or caution tape. So this invitation was to do something a bit different. And I wanted to give him the opportunity at our starting place to connect with historical belongings from the collection. So I asked him, do you have particular things you want to see? And he said, just show me what beadwork you have, show me what speaks to you, and we'll try to breathe life into the archives together. So the beaded legging that you see in the center there was something that immediately was of great interest to me. I've never really seen an Anishinaabe belonging that looked quite like this. So that was one of the things that I brought out right away, and he immediately gravitated towards it as well and took pictures of the ribbon work designs, they're almost like little mosaics of silk ribbon that create those horizontal patterns. He took photographs of those, looked at the precise beadwork underneath, and then also looked at other Anishinaabe belongings, and shared with me, what's so interesting about this legging is I'm seeing patterns here that I don't normally see within my community. So this is illustrating that people were connected outside of colonial constructs. These different tribal communities were engaging with one another, sharing artistic processes and media to create new types of garments. And he was really moved by that and decided to bring those patterns out onto the plaza. So you see the ribbon work patterns are the substrate, the background for each of those stair rising patterns. And then he overlaid, which you can see a bit more easily here, more traditional Anishinaabe beadwork patterns on top of that ribbon work, and created this three-part piece called Breeze. And that honored his cousin, who was an accomplished jingle dress dancer. So we see those beaded strips with the jingle dance cones underneath. And it really kind of invites this sense of movement, of sound and dance and song and prayers that we see with jingle dress dancers. He felt it was very important to uplift other Anishinaabe folks in this project. So he asked Anishinaabe photographer John Paye if we could present the photograph you see at the right there of a jingle dress dancer that was at one of the first powwows after COVID had shut down the powwow circuit. So it felt important to draw that connection between historical belongings, contemporary practice, and then to bring that onto the stoop. So these were large-scale installations that you could like jingle. I saw many people kind of moving these around, hearing the musicality of the jingles, and then they changed over time. The way that these jingles interacted with the light was really interesting. Here they look gold, but here they look purple. So we got to have a totally different art experience based on what time of day you were coming. Are you zipping by in your car? Are you stopping and maybe coming inside and seeing the pieces that inspired and were used to photograph or create the photographs represented on the stair risers. And then one final thing that's worth noting is the pattern we see on that jingle is derived from an Anishinaabe sugar mold. So that we see that piece of wood in the front there has these beautiful patterns cut into it. So Anishinaabe folks would pour maple syrup into it, and you can actually see the drip marks and allow it to harden, and then it would pop out like a beautiful little sculptural maple sugar cube. And so he wanted to bring that onto the jingle. So we have further interconnection between these historical items and what he was creating today. So this was something where, I think he expressed enormous gratitude to his ancestors and his relatives who are still dancing today and brought incredible care and thought to his work. Then the final project, the 11th project of 2024 was a complete reinstallation of the Brooklyn Museum's American Wing called Toward Joy, New Frameworks for American Art. This is a radical departure with what one may have seen in previous iterations of the Brooklyn Museum's American Wing. It is conceived as, in a way, 8 separate mini exhibitions organized around particular frameworks or ideas that invite dialogue across different collection areas. So we see a couple of the galleries here. On the left, we have Trouble the Water, which is thinking about the enormous cultural importance of water and how it can be a site of connection. And the work that this is a major sightline in the gallery, this to the settler painting of Niagara Falls. And something that felt very important to do at the outset was to interrupt this sightline and to put Native voices and Native artistic presence ahead of it. And so when you're looking into this gallery towards that Niagara Falls, you get to see beadwork that could have been sold at Niagara Falls by Haudenosaunee beadworkers who are innovating this enormously within this medium. And in that way, we're grounding ourselves with where we are. We're in New York. This is New York Native communities still live here. They still create artworks like this. And we wanted to bring out some of these kind of deep track from the vaults is what I was calling them. Some things that have never been on view before. In this case, this was a relatively recent acquisition, the beaded bag, but elsewhere in the galleries, there are baskets that have never been on view for the 120 years they've been in the museum's collection. So this was a moment to breathe life into those belongings, to express care for them, and to share them with the public. On the right, we see a different framework to give flowers. So we're looking at the ways in which Indigenous women or women artists in general, and I have a particular eye to Indigenous women artists, have utilized imagery of floral arrangements, or in the case of a lot of Native artists, they're depicting flowers through beadwork. That is a very particular strategy that Indigenous women employ to keep cultural traditions alive. So in moments where they were not able to use traditional media, where that wasn't practical anymore, they adopted these new media like beads and new formats like floral beadwork to perpetuate knowledge within their community and to ensure that cultural care protocols move forward. So then the final gallery I want to speak about is that is very aligned with this talk today. It's radical care. So this gallery thinks about care along the lines of how do we care for audiences as they come into these spaces? What do Native audience members want to see? How do they want their cultures to be represented? So within radical care, there are two major pillars upholding the Native art presentation. And the first is this idea of rematriation. So many people have probably heard the term repatriation, which means returning belongings to source communities. So if they're particular, anything funerary, if there are human remains, if there are used within today's religious practices, those sorts of items can be subject to repatriation. But rematriation is a much broader term. This is something that we think about in terms of the way Indigenous people foster relationships with the land. So the materials, the plant relatives that support the creation of baskets. We think about rematriation along those avenues. And we also think about rematriation in terms of the ways in which Indigenous women artists carried forward practices and ensured the continuity of culture over time. Carol and Martha Douglas's basket, Gathering of Nations, illustrates that idea of rematriation in such a beautiful way. On this piece, we see 11 women from different Indigenous communities identified by their regalia, each holding out a miniature basket, both to the viewers on the outside of the vitrine, as well as to each other on the interior of the basket. And this work is incredibly special. This is one of my favorites in the collection because, first of all, miniatures are incredibly difficult to make, but the fact that Carol wove each of these baskets in the style of the different tribe represented is truly a technical marvel. These stitches are microscopic, and we get to see each of these women like representing their culture on their own terms, which I think is such a beautiful statement in the gallery. And that was made in the 21st century, and we have many, many hundreds of baskets from the late 19th century. So I wanted to bring those into the galleries as well and to have a dialogue across that space. So you can see the case on the left there. Those are 5 baskets that come from across what is now the United States and Canada. And that case is thinking about the ways in which women worked with plant relatives from their particular region to create these beautiful belongings, sometimes for sale and sometimes for use within community. The other pillar that's upholding this gallery is a large-scale reproduction of the Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving address, Greetings to the Natural World. So this is also known as the words that come before all else, and when Haudenosaunee communities do anything important, the thing that they start with are these words of thanks, expressing gratitude for all of the entities that make life possible. So this is positioned alongside a monumental Bierstadt painting, and we felt it was really important to balance the representation to show something equally monumental that is coming from Native communities. And again, we're tapping into site specificity. So we are really focusing on the New York region and the surrounding region through both representing this text and then representing Haudenosaunee belongings within this framework. So here we see Hayden Haynes and Samantha Jacobs bag New Beginnings above some 19th century moccasins. And Samantha and Hayden are both very accomplished traditional artists who are revitalizing artistic practices that had nearly been lost as a result of colonization. So in Hayden's case, he is doing comb carving, like what we see at the center of that bag. And in Samantha's case, she is doing moose hair embroidery or animal hair embroidery, which was supplanted by beadwork and by, silk embroidery later generations. So it felt very important to create a dialogue across time. So by putting those into that piece into conversation with the 19th century moccasins, we understand that the cultural care is ongoing. This isn't something that just happened in the past and people have moved forward. This is a constant dialogue within the artistic sphere. And one wonderful thing that I've loved always mentioning whenever I talk about these moccasins is actually you got to see, if you flipped them over, you could see the footprints of the people that originally wore these shoes. So what is it to think? What is it to care for that ancestor who had worn these shoes over 100 years ago? How would they want their communities to be represented in this space of the museum? So we grappled with that a lot in the forward-facing work we do, but we also try to bring care and empathy and love to what we do on the back of house work, the stuff you can't see, like database work, which sounds so boring, but it's actually really wonderful to get to know the belongings in a different way. So something that is a top highlight of my job is inviting Indigenous community members in to visit belongings from their communities. Sometimes it's belongings that are associated with their ancestors. And in the case of this peyote gourd here, this was very early in my time at Brooklyn. We had some Osage folks reach out because they were coming to the city. They wanted to see some items that were associated with one of their ancestors. And so we brought them back into the storage area and made our space available to them. We allow people to smudge in our storage space. And it was really moving to be present for that and to hear that hear Osage with this peyote gourd. And I asked myself, when is the last time this belonging heard its language? Like, when is the last time it got to hear Osage? That's an incredible act of nourishing care for the belonging, for it to be put in touch with its community in that way. And during our conversation, after we visited storage, we wrapped up, I showed them the database information just so they know what we have. And I asked, does any of this need to be updated? Do you want me to put any notes in this system? Because it's important that knowledge outlive an individual. Like, I can't just be the memory of these different interactions. All of this needs to be documented with consent from the community members. And they said, I see that you're calling it rattle. I think people misunderstand that term. They're going to think this has to do with babies. They're going to feel like it's trivialized if people come in and see this word. We call it a gourd. Would you update it? And I'm like, absolutely. And I put in the database, this was requested by these, community members. This was the rationale. And so now moving forward, that record is always going to say peyote gourd. And when people go into the back end and want to learn why, there's a full explanation of the rationale. So all of this lives beyond any single individual, and that care can be held forward for future generations. Another example of care that I've brought to work at the museum is doing a lot of repatriation work. So we have completed the first repatriations to First Nations or Canadian First Nations in the institution's history. We have a policy guiding that uses NAGPRA, or the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act frameworks. That's a federal United States law that defines particular types of belongings that would be subject to repatriation. We recognize that it's not fair that this exists for communities in the United States, but if you live 90 miles on the wrong side of this colonial border, as the Getgafla Nation does, you don't get to repatriate by federal law. So we saw that as a problem and decided as an institution to adopt a repatriation protocol or policy that utilizes NAGPRA for First Nations claims. So in the case here, Gitgafla Nation reached out about a gambling mat that you see on the table there. That was an item that was associated with an incredibly important cultural leader, Chief Shakes, who helped Gitgafla Nation make it through this incredibly problematic point of colonial contact. And it fulfilled the repatriation requirements, so we were happy to assist and returning that home. And as a gift, when when their folks came to pick up the gambling mat, they brought a new one that could be a replacement for the one that was being deaccessioned, so that their community is still represented in the collection. So if you have the opportunity to come to the Brooklyn Museum, this is actually on view in a Building the Collection exhibition now. But this drives home that, expressing gratitude and embodying care is core to what we do as a museum, both internally, working on the back end, and externally. We want to promote care and express gratitude in all that we do. And that raises my next project, which I'll just give a quick plug for. In October 2026, the Brooklyn Museum will open Hopi Kachina Dolls Blessings for a Balanced World, which I am co-curating in partnership with Nancy Rossoff, a long-term curator here, and Colleen Lucero, who's a Hopi guest co-curator. And we are working in partnership with the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office. And this show looks at the Kachina doll tradition through the eyes of the girls and women who receive these dolls as gifts from the Kachina spirits. With the show, we are setting aside, really generations of exhibitions that have focused on culturally insensitive topics like the male carvers or, the different carving styles. Those topics are not safe for Hopi children to encounter. I've heard of other museums where, they've gotten bad feedback from community saying, we don't feel safe bringing our kids to see this Kachina doll show because you're revealing elements of this tradition that they shouldn't know until they're old enough. So with all of those things in mind, we really want to frame this show around these items as treasured gifts from the Katsinam, from the ancestral spirits, and to tap into the ways that these gifts make a lifelong impression on their recipients. Women artists working today often represent Katsinam or imagery inspired by the Katsinam within their own artist practices, be it, their potters, including Katsina imagery on tiles, or weavers weaving it into their baskets. We see this materialize in a lot of Hopi cultural and artistic production. So we wanted to honor the relationship between women and girls and the Katsinam spirits for that show. So come and visit us in October of this year, and we'll have a whole new show to share with you.
Thank you so much, Dare, for that fantastic presentation and a lot for us to get to think about and to discuss. I will open with one question and then encourage folks to put questions into the Q&A. We have one we'll get to from Nina. Thinking about the scope and the ambition, and I imagine the impact of the Indigenizing project that you did across many, many exhibitions at the Baltimore Art Museum, what came to mind for me was an exhibition from a number of years, and the amazing work you're doing at the Brooklyn Museum around rematriation and the voices of women in Indigenous communities. I thought of Elle at Centre Pompidou, and that this exhibition from a number of years ago where the Centre Pompidou in Paris took down, not all, but much of their collection that was the work of male artists, and created a feminist look at this very old collection. And I don't think I've seen, until you've spoken about your work and your collaborators' work at the Baltimore Art Museum, something of that kind of scale and ambition that flips the script and makes us see and understand the collection in such a different way and from a different perspective. I wonder if you can speak to that work and its impact and working on that scale and the response and what that has meant for that museum and maybe other institutions that are seeing what you're doing. Because I think Elle Centre Pompidou was part around 2007, 2008 of a number of museums rethinking their very male-centered collections. And I think we're in another moment where we're rethinking our how our many institutional collections are centered in a different way.
Yeah, it's interesting balancing, like short-term major impact versus long-term lasting impact. I think we were really focused on making a very big corrective gesture by having almost every programmable space given over to Native art. We're correcting for like most of my lifetime of Native absence within this space. So it felt really important to us to have that full court press, but then have moments that could live on. So, for people that end up wanting to be curators, my hot tip that I give everybody is try to get a book out of your shows, because that is what makes it so, 10 years from now, when people want to learn about what you did, that's the record of what you did. I think that those kind of documentation efforts are really important, because that is what people in future generations will look to. Ideally, the audio tour stops would have outlived the course of the project. It's a little tricky since I left the role in the middle of executing that project. I was so grateful. I would have never been able to abandon that project. I got to see it all the way through, but I don't get to control like what happens after. We had dreams, we had ambitions of what processes would be put into place as a result of the project. And I think a lot of those have worked really wonderfully. Like those partnerships with Native community members outlast an individual. That's incredibly important. And that's another thing I think other museums need to work towards, is really figuring out ways to enshrine those partnerships within the institution, rather than it being like Dare's, community contact or friend or, person that she knows through the Native scene. We need that to be an institutional contact. So as much as we can, put things in writing, make sure that they can live beyond just the limited presentation in the gallery. If you can get, instead of doing a Native community advisory board, are there Native people you can bring on to collections committees or the board? Like bureaucratic arms of the museum that will live forever. I wanted to be able to infiltrate those moments. So I think it's good to have a yes and approach, do a little bit of the long-term vision setting, and hopefully serve as a model to the field on what's possible.
That leads very nicely into a question from Nina, who's asking, thanking you for sharing all these ideas, and has a question about how can institutions with no experience of these kinds of projects take this on and start, appreciating this idea of focusing on positive stories and not only difficult histories, and how can that be a starting point?
I think it definitely can. I went through a period in grad school where I would go and like see Native art presentations in like anthropology museums and cry every single time, even though I was an adult, because everything was framed through loss or difficult histories, or that was not even discussed at all, and everything was being radically misrepresented. So I think focusing on listening as the starting place. So if you want to work with Native communities, listen to what they want. We kept hearing in our listening sessions around Preoccupied, Native community members saying, we're here and we feel like we're invisible, and that was something that came up. I grappled with that in the book. We grappled with that in the show. So that radical listening was at the start. And I think partnering, like a phrase I always use and feel a little bit dorky using, but I'm going to use it here, is like friendship is core to curatorial work, because when you're friends with someone, you can have more difficult conversations. You can be realer with one another. You can ask that person to like tweak that case for the 10th time, and hopefully because you're friends, it will be okay. You can like extend yourself, go beyond your comfort zone when there's that foundation of trust. So starting with listening, starting with friendships would be my recommendation. And, do your best. Like even if you don't have the friends with the knowledge, I bet your friends have friends with the knowledge. And a lot of people are really generous in the field and willing to chat with people. So trying to tap into those networks would be my recommendation.
Thank you. I saw you also engaged with Live Oak, and I had worked Dina Dart and worked with her in the past a long time ago, and she was wonderful. So I do see for institutions that are totally new to this, maybe engaging with a native consultation group like that too, as a piece could be something to consider.
Absolutely.
I see a wonderful question from a student. Oh, and Jill Strauss, I will if we don't has a quick question. Have you written on your exhibition projects? And I think I would recommend your catalogs.
Yeah, I've got some
so
catalogs right here.
Yeah.
So I already shared Preoccupied, but here's another catalog. Woo. The books that outlive the project. So this is the
Exactly.
reinstallation of the American Wing. We have a book for that. Hopi will have a book coming out also through Marquand Publishers that's coming out in October as well. That's a good place to start. I've written for the Native Arts and Cultures Foundation magazine too. That was kind of my original piece on curation as care, where I get into some of that etymology Kat was mentioning of this caring for souls. So I recommend checking all of those out.
And then, two great questions from students that I'll bring out. Christian Rosales is asking about the GORD, listening to you speak about the GORD and Indigenous community input and how that can be extended to real decision-making power in the institution. And we'll go with that one. I was going to combine two questions, but they're really two different questions, like two different thoughts.
I think that, let's see. So having protocols or programs in place so Indigenous communities are not just consulted. Yeah, the tricky thing about working with Native community members as consultants means that they don't have the final say. Like you could hear them say, we hate it. And just because they're consultants and, not co-curators, them not liking it isn't an automatic stopping place. So I think I mentioned before, building Native representation into existing structures like the board is an incredibly helpful way to ensure that Native representation outlives a single employee. So with board members who are Native, we know that Native voice is going to be viewed as a source of authority. And I encourage people to figure out ways to embed that in. And if embedding it into existing protocols isn't possible, I think it's important to outline what a consultant gets to do at the start. So when people sign on and say, okay, I will be a consultant, they know a consultant provides feedback on this. They will be listened to in these ways. This is the sort of feedback we're looking for. I think consultation that fails is overly broad, doesn't have clear goals at the outset. We're just like chatting. No, we need to go in with a mission, like particular questions where we need guidance on XYZ. They know that they can provide guidance on that. I think building all of that into the process from the get-go is really critical.
Thank you. This is great. And Queen, I thought you might ask about this. Queen Hall, another student, was asking about how you spoke about the gaps in NAGPRA. And given that she has a particular interest in seeing African Indigenous belongings and enslaved people's belongings returned, maybe you could speak to those gaps and how legislation is being developed, or how you address
I don't think it's being developed.
the lack.
I'll be honest with you. I feel like NAGPRA is there were major revisions that were done in the last administration. I think it was 2023. Major changes to more clearly stating what item or what sorts of materials are repatriatable under NAGPRA. Luckily, that happened in the last administration. I'm fearful for the future of NAGPRA. Theoretically, it's protected because it's something that's governed by Congress rather than an executive order, but that seems to not matter. So who knows? But I think when it comes to, there are certain matters where NAGPRA is a very helpful guide. So human remains, like it's sad to me that we have to have laws that say you shouldn't have human remains in museums. They should go back to the indigenous communities that they came from. It's sad to me that those laws need to exist, but they do. And so I'm glad that NAGPRA oversees that. I think NAGPRA offers very clear definitions of what sort of sacred materials are subject to repatriation through law. And those are very helpful guidelines because it's very concrete. It was wishy-washy before when it comes to cultural affiliations. You know, a lot of institutions, not Brooklyn, no place I've ever worked, ended up weaponizing the old legislation, being like, oh, well, we can't know whose remains these are, so I guess we'll just have them forever. So it closed the loop on a lot of those kind of weird loopholes. But some of the specificity that NAGPRA brings to ideas around repatriation isn't applicable for communities outside of Indigenous peoples of the United States. I think some of it translates really neatly to Canada because they have similar governance structures where when I want to repatriate something or when a tribe wants it back, I'm working with tribal authorities. It's a government. It's not like, you know, this random individual. It's someone who is given the authority from their government or is a direct descendant of the person in the collection. Thankfully, that's not relevant for Brooklyn. But those models don't really work with African communities as I understand it. There's not the same legislative bodies for different tribal communities. And it gets tricky when we're looking at descent communities. So people who don't have that direct connection back to government. You know, what is the authoritative body for communities of that descended from enslaved people? I don't know that NAGPRA works so well for that. There are lessons to be learned though, and I know there are many, many colleagues in the field that are grappling with these things when it comes to, you know, Benin bronzes. Where do those go? And what if the repatriation processes, how have they been successful? And if not, what can we learn from the failures? So there are other people out there doing lots of good work.
Thank you. And we have had a couple programs on repatriation in this series, and I'm sure because it's a complex question and it's different regionally, communities, as laws change, we probably will have others in the future. I will take one more question for a student and then turn it back to Laura. And this one is a little bit more about your background, Darren, how you came to specialize in Indigenous art as a focal point of your curation, and how you've come to know so many people in different tribes and different members and able to do this work today.
Yeah, I mean, I'm Native. I feel like maybe I didn't say that at the beginning. So it's baked into the culture, my community. I grew up around a sea of Yurok baskets, hearing my grandfather's songs, you know, eating our traditional foods. And so some of my earliest memories of childhood are with that community. And so it made a very strong impression. And I didn't think I was always going to work in Native art. I thought, you know, I had a deep interest in medieval art because there's actually, interestingly, a lot of overlap and a focus on the individual's experience with the art object. So I thought about that for a while, but I feel a really pressing need in the field for people that are Indigenous and willing to navigate the bureaucracies that are that come along with museums, and also folks that are willing to work with historical collections. There are many museums who have vast historical collections where you have to deal with things like NAGPRA, and a lot of professionals in the field don't want to have to do that, and that is totally their right. I'm willing to do that, and I want to be a community advocate, a helper. That to me is something that I'm in a very privileged position where I can do that advocacy work. So I felt a call on many different fronts, and I feel like so grateful that I have the space at the Brooklyn Museum to do this kind of work.
Thank you, dear. I'll throw in one just little side related question. I apologize. It'll be very quick, but it's because so many students and quite a few who are here today that we have coming through our Gallery Museum Studies program are interested in doing the work of repatriation and are looking to find ways to path towards that work. If there's anything, last notes you can share about fellowships or experiences or things that you advice you would give to them who are looking to go into that work and are in the very early stages of a museum career, I know they would be so grateful.
Yeah, I think there's a listserv NAGPRA community of practice. There are jobs all of the time posted on that group. There are also really good dialogues where a museum will be like, this is an issue that's coming up with me. What are you guys doing about this? How are you consulting about these sorts of objects? Or have you gotten these kinds of claims? I think that that is a great starting place. And also, like, while the National Park Service's website still exists, like utilizing as many resources that they make available on there. There are webinars hosted by National NAGPRA where they walk you through the new legislation. They show all the sort of different documents that you now need to work through as an institution to get up into compliance. I think doing that kind of work is really good exposure, seeing like, ooh, is this something I actually want to deal with? And then also building up those database skills. So every museum I've ever worked at has used the museum system, TMS. I am a TMS power user, and like it is incredibly important to have that skill set when you're pulling together lists of objects from communities, or you're taking consulting notes. You want to make sure everything lives in the database, so that way you're not relying on floppy disks and printouts from 1992 from like tribal correspondence. No, we need to bring it to the present moment and have it be in TMS. So those are my two recommendations.
That is really helpful. We're grateful for your advice and grateful for your time and your presentation and your knowledge. Thank you so much. It's been fantastic to be in conversation. And I will hand it back to Laura to close us out. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you so much, Dare, and thank you so much, Kat. It's been eye-opening each time I hear your presentations, and there were some things that really stood out this time as the KHC and a lot of smaller Holocaust education centers were in the process also of professionalizing. So I really feel when you say relationships are key, how do you institutionalize a relationship so they don't leave when people leave, and TMS. We have to go down that path. And
good work. It's a good life skill.
And while you were speaking, it's so interesting because many years ago in the 80s and 90s, the center had done audio testimony recordings with Holocaust survivors on audio cassettes. And they sat in a closet for a very long time. And periodically, we do get people who reach out. The reason I'm mentioning this is the importance of also sharing this knowledge. So we wound up donating these cassettes to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And each time there's an article where somebody refers back to it. So how do we keep the memory? How do we share the memory? And how do we invite community into the process? So thank you. Thank you both for spending time. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. And on behalf of the Kupferberg Holocaust Center, we hope you stay safe and be well. Thanks, everyone.